Hi there. Welcome once again to Reading Aristotle's Politics. I'm Clifford Bates, and we're going to be today looking at uh, uh, Politics, Book 2, Chapter 8, the story of Hippodemus. Now, again, we left off finishing with looking at Valiant and Caldeon. Um, Basically, the first political kind of one of the people who are the first ones to deal with communism or the claim of equality. After looking at Plato's account, both in the Republic, which is his unique, which he discusses. Remember, whole book two is about the regimes or the cities best held to be administered, right? And then instead of going directly into the actual cities or regimes, he then talks about the theoretical accounts, these written accounts, people who talked about it, or either they propose cities. The first proposition was Plato's Republic, where Socrates proposes his city of speech, and then the last he also addresses the more practical solution given in the laws by Plato. And both of these accounts, he said that weren't that were set. There was problems with them. And he gave the reasons, and then he did with Phalius of Calderon, who gives is basically who basically addresses the communism question before Socrates or different, but again, it was the same problems that he addressed. But now we turn to the next intellectual, non-Socratic writer who talks about politics or how to organize cities, and that is Hippodemus. Now let's turn to chapter 8. Hippodemus, son of Euphoron of Miletus, who invented the division of cities and laid out the Piraeus, and who was extraordinary in other aspects of his life through ambition. In other words, we're going to stop here. I'm going to continue this. He says extraordinary, but in other words, he's famous as he's the first city planner. He's the first urban planner, and he's responsible for laying out the arrangement of the Piraeus, right? For laid out the Piraeus, which is that the port aspect, the extension of Athens to its port, to the port, including the port, because originally the port was outside. It was kind of outside of Athens proper, and that as it grew and the port became more important, it expanded the walls to the port. Okay, and therefore this is and the way the Piraeus was laid out, and then he also laid out for other cities. Okay, this and now. Therefore, he was the first urban planner. Right. This is my true. When my professor, Dr. D'Alvarez, he made the reference, the first urban planner. And that always stuck with me in that sense. Right. The people who organize cities. And now he was but who was extraordinary in other aspects of his life through ambition, so that he seemed to live to some. He seemed to some to live in a rather overdone manner, with long hair and expensive ornaments, and furthermore with cheap and warm clothing, which he wore out not only in winter but also in summer weather, and who wished to be learned with regard to nature as a whole, but was the first of those not engaged in politics to undertake to give their account of the best regime. Now, Lord has 62 now. I want to look at it. And Hippodamus seems to have gone around the middle of the 5th century as a colonist to Italy, where he planned the cities of Thurii. This is a given by Dirty. And nothing is known of his activity in the Piraeus, however, the port of Athens. He apparently introduced the division of the city into regular quarters and straight streets, which Aristotle later criticized in Book 7. Hippodamus's intent in natural philosophy seems to be reflected in his predilection for threefold divisions. This suggests the influence of this is the Parathegianism, which Aristotle talks about that in Book on the Heavens. Aristotle's personal comments on him are extraordinary and indeed unique in his Aristotle's writing. In other words, Aristotle goes out to talk about him personally in a way. You can't talk about his ideas without talking about his personality, Hippodamus' personality, right? He's extraordinary. he dresses ornately. In other words, he dress. In other words, his attire is part of his persona. Okay, this is like we see this like there. We have intellectuals and people who are similar like the or stars. Right, he's a star. Okay, his dress. Now his dress is what it's about natural. He's concerned with nature. He's in, he therefore he's regarding nature as a whole. It's holistic. He has a holistic understanding. He wanted his his thoughts about how the city should be tied to some kind of something inherent or holistically tied to nature, right? Um, but then again, he wore his long hair. The image of him is rather overdone, long hair, but also his clothing is kind of cheap, but the same kind of clothing, both winter and summer. Like, okay, I'm not going to give any TV examples of people like, but we don't know. We have this, right? And he says what? But he's also the first of those not engaged in politics to give an account of the best regime. So he's kind of like he's before Plato, in fact. Right? He's the first intellectual who's not active in politics, who gives an account of the best regime. This is not before people give accounts of lawgivers, legislators, people who are active. This is someone who's not active in politics, who's outside of the activity of politics, who gives an account of the best regime. Right. Now he goes what he goes now. Let's go to the second section. He wanted to institute a city of 10,000 men divided into three parts, and to make one part artisans, one farmers, and the third the military part, and that part possessing arms. He also divided the territory into three parts, one sacred, one public, one private. This division it was relatively common one in the Greek city, he says. In other words, the three parts, but this last one, the sacred, the public, and the private. The sacred must provide for what custom requires to be rendered to the gods, the public for the warriors to live off of, and the private that what belongs to the farmers. He supposed, that there are three kinds of laws as well, since the things concerning which cases arise and are three in number: arrogant behavior, injury, and death. Again, this looks over here. This division is truly congruent with the categories of Greek private law, but omits all offenses relating to the city or to religion. Arrogant behavior, hubris, encompasses sexual as well as physical assault. Okay, so the arrogant behavior. So therefore, he's saying this. What's missing here is the political crimes and religious crimes are missing here. That the three, even though he talks about the sacred, right? He talks about arrogant behavior, hubris, right? And this is both physical assault and sexual assault, as Lord talks about. Injury, harm, and then torts, that's it, and death, people who kill people, homicides. Um, Religious crimes are missing, and also political crimes are missing in this case. He also wished to legislate a single authoritative court to which all cases that are held not to have been rightly judged should be appealed. Creator of the Supreme Court, okay? The idea of a Supreme Court. He is the father of this idea, in that sense. There should be a single authoritative court, which, if at appellate level, that all, in other words, that where cases not have been judged rightly should be appealed. This he wanted to institute out of a certain number of. He wanted to institute out of a certain number of elected elders. So again, the idea of the judges are going to be elders who are elected. Will be this high court, the father of the Supreme Court. Okay, I gotta think. I never. Actually, I always paid attention to his role as city planner, right, in his obscure life. But he's also the father of the idea of that the court there should be a kind of a single Supreme Court in that sense, as an appellate court overseeing all the rulings of all the other courts. Now this is actually interesting, okay, in that sense. In fact, he's the father of that. Mm. Oh, this is his idea. He supposed that decisions in the court should not be rendered by a ballot, but that each should deposit a tablet on which, if he condemns, simply he should write the verdict, or if he simply acquitted, to leave it blank. But if neither, he should make distinctions. In other words, again, think of the Supreme Court rulings. What happens is that they give their opinions, right? Therefore, they give the ruling and what they should do. In other words, again, this is very interesting. Again, let's go back for a second. Let's think about this. This is actually, he says, if in other words, he should write the verdict, right? If he's going to condemn, he should write. If not, then leave it blank. But if neither, it should make a distinction. Like, let's explain what did he think in this. For if he supposed for he supposed current legislation is not fine, beautiful. Aristotle, this is the word here is kalos in the Greek. So beautiful, good, noble in this regard, as it compels men to purge themselves if they judge one way or to the other. So he felt that the idea, the current way of doing this, made men kind of perjure themselves in that sense if they didn't think of this. Okay, he wanted to enact a law concerning those who discover something. Another next thing, he wanted to introduce a law, discover something useful to the city, so that they might obtain honor, and one providing that the children of those who die in war should receive sustenance from public funds. He supposed this had never been, in other words, he said, again, this is what he wanted to make sure those who discovered something to get something useful to the city, right? So they maintain honor. And and that's one thing. The second thing is that providing that children who die, the children of those who die in war should receive sustenance from public funds. Again, this Aristotle says he supposed that this had never had legislated by others, although such laws exist both now in Athens and in other cities. So in other words, at the time he said this wasn't done, but we know that today we know that these laws exist. So the question is he really responsible for these laws, or is he just echoing a theme that other people that in other words, that's kind of the hint here. The rulers were all to be elected by the people, and the people there, and the people there, the three parts of the city. Again, by who the people? The people being the three parts of the city. So all by the three parts of the city. Those elected were to take care of the common matters, matters affecting aliens and matters affecting orphans. Okay? So therefore, there's three issues. The city has to deal with the three issues of one, taking care of common matters, two, affecting aliens, and the third, affecting the orphans. Right. The three parts will elect the things. These officers will have three responsibilities, right? Uh, uh, okay, these are most of the elements of Hippodemus arrangement, and these most deserving mention. One, the first question. Okay, now these things we talked about here are those which deserve mention. This is the most ones these dealt with, right? The first question one might raise concerning the vision of the multitude of citizens. Right? So let's look at the question of the multitude. So we've talked about all the ideas he had, right? And now he said these are the biggest elements of those ideas that were, in other words, that deserve mention. Because there are other ideas he might have mentioned, but they don't really deserve mention. Um, the first of this that ought to rise concern is the division of multitude. This idea of this, he says, the artisans and the farmers and those possessing arms all share in the regime. Though the farmers have no arms and the artisans neither land nor arms, so that they become virtually slaves of those possessing arms. In other words, this is very interesting. He says that whoever possesses the arms will control the city, and they will become and the unarmed will be dictated to or controlled or made slaves to, to those who are armed. So therefore, the artisans, both the farmers and the artisans, are not armed. the farmers own land, but they don't own are not going to own arms, and the artisans don't own land or arms. So they're going to both be, in other words, that so that they have virtually become slaves of those possessing arms. Right? It is impossible then for them to partake in all the prerogatives, since the generals and the regime guardians, um, uh, and particularly all the authoritative offices were necessary to be selected from those possessing arms. Yet if they do not take part in the regime, how will they feel any affection towards it? Okay, right? So let's look at some of these footnotes, and I think they're important. The prerogatives here, 65. This is honors, the honors, timai, the honors. So the again, he's referring to the honors. So from all the honors, right? They partake in all the honors, prerogatives. He's saying that's I'm not happy with that. If it's timai, it's honors. It's not prerogatives. Prerogatives mean functions of things. Prerogatives mean the unwritten functions of an office. I disagree with Lord here. I think Lord's translation here it should be honors, because if the Greek is timai, it is things of honor, things of merit, right? And since the generals and the regime guardians, now this is 66, the politokratikes. The term is this is polito. Okay, this is probably the terms of Hippodemus' own term. It is uncertain what kind of officials are meant. The, this is interesting. His term, piloto, political pilots. The political is political. This is like physics, and this is some kind of expert or one who carries out something. Again, this is and particularly all the authoritative officers would be necessary with those men at arms. If that's the case, the farmers and the artisans not possessing arms won't participate in these offices. And since they do not partake in the regime, how they won't how they have affection towards it. Those possessing arms would then have to be superior to both of the other parts. But this would not be easy unless there were many of them. Okay, there'd be many of soldiers, many things. But this would not be easy if there's not many of them. And if that is to be the case, why should the others take part in the regime and will have authority with respect to the selections of rulers? In other words, and have authority with respect to, in other words, if they're not going to be taking the regime, why are you going to let these people who have not taken the regime are going to have some input with the rulers? Since they won't carry arms, they won't have any offices from that, but you're giving them they may not even like the regime, so they're going to sabotage the regime by appointing bad people. That's the way you can screw it up. That in other words, you don't pick the best. In other words, if I don't feel if I'm excluded from holding things in mine, you might say, well, I don't want a competent person in charge. I want an incompetent person in charge. I want someone who's going to be corrupt and bad because, or at least maybe not change things or break the rules to give us more say. Right. Again, this is what he's saying. Aristotle's hinting at here. In other words, this is why should the others take part in the regime and have authority with respect to the section of the rulers? Furthermore, what use are the farmers to the city? Further, what use are farmers to the city? That's even more interesting. What use? The answer is you don't eat. It is necessary that there be artisans for every city. It needs artisans and they can subsist as they do in other cities from their art. In other words, it would have been reasonable to make the farmers a part of the city if they provide sustenance to those possessing arms, as it is. However, they have private land and are able to farm this privately. Okay, that's even more interesting. They have private land; they have that privately, and for the common land from which the warriors are to have their sustenance, are they to farm it themselves? There would be no difference between fighting and farming element. contrary to the wish of the legislature. But if there are to be others different from both of these farming privately and from the fighters, this will be an additional fourth part of the city which shares in nothing and is foreign to the regime. So he points out, okay, so therefore the land that the soldiers are going to live off of, who's farming it? Who's taking this up? The farmers are sustaining themselves from their farmland. Is there a fourth part you're not mentioning? The fighters are going to go up there. That, in other words, you have this. The farmers are kind of like not really part of the city logically, in that sense. They get to say something to the city. They're like this is that unless he means that they will do both. That shares nothing foreign. In other words, the additional fourth part which shares in nothing. The next sentence. On the other hand, if one makes the same person farm both the private and the public land. Okay, let's look at this. It's up here. Will not amount the crops of each from the amount of crops from each one farming be insufficient for two households? Or why is it if they do not supply, simply take sustenance for themselves from the land and their own allotment, and also provide it to the fighters? In other words, why is there two of these lots? And if the farmer's going to be the one working on both, then wait a minute, what's going on? Why isn't sufficient? Is the amount of crop from each one's farming to be insufficient for two households? You have to have two households. You have to have two establishments. You have to manage these two different places. Right? Well, why is it that they simply do not take sustenance from themselves, from the land, and their own allotment, and provide it to the fighters? Right? If all these things, there is much confusion. In other words, there's much confusing about the question of hiding of the farmers. This is the problem of. In other words, it's not clear. But I miss. I know. This is elder moment. Hippodemus. Okay, I need to look at the word. It is simply just a moment of the crisis. Hippodemus was not specific. He just mentioned it in history 3, but he didn't really explain who's farming, and how is the farmer going to handle both these things, and how it's going to organize. And is it, in other words, it's unclear here. This is the unclarity leads to problems. Nor is the law concerning judging a fine one, a beautiful one, kalam, to require the one judging to make decisions when the indictment in the case is simple. This making the juror an arbiter. In other words, this is bad. In other words, the thing should not. In other words, the indictment is the juror, the person making the ruling, should only be ruling on the crime that's being accused. He